They didn't just hurt you, they studied you, mirrored you, and fed on your light. But what if I told you not you weren't a victim? You were chosen to expose the dark, chosen to awaken, chosen to rise. They saw you, and something inside them shifted, not in love, not in admiration, but in discomfort, because you carried something they couldn't fake. You carried light, not just the surface kind that shows up in smiles and good manners, but a soul-deep light, a warmth that radiated without trying, a truth that stood still even when you were shaking. And that kind of light? It's dangerous to those hiding in darkness. They were drawn to you like moths to flame, not because they wanted to feel the heat, but because they wanted to control it. You didn't just walk into their life, you revealed it. You exposed the chaos behind the charm, the hollowness beneath the confidence. You were the mirror they couldn't avoid. And when a person who has lived behind masks sees their real self in someone else's eyes, it causes terror. You didn't even know you were holding a mirror. You just loved deeply, gave freely, asked questions, set boundaries. And every one of those simple acts reflected back to them what they weren't, where they lacked, where their control began to crack. They tried to reshape your reflection. Gaslighting, manipulation, triangulation, those weren't random. Those were tools of distortion, because if they could twist how you saw yourself, they could stop seeing who they really were. They needed you blind to your power, needed you unsure, questioning, dependent, because the longer you stayed confused, the longer their illusion could breathe. You didn't stay because you were weak. You stayed because you had hope, because your love believed in change, because your empathy made space for the brokenness behind their behavior. You thought you were saving them, but in truth, you were holding a mirror so precise that they couldn't escape the truth. That's what made you dangerous. They watched how you forgave without forgetting, how you cried but still stood tall, how even when you doubted yourself, you still showed up with grace. That resilience wasn't just admirable, it was threatening, because it reminded them of what they could never sustain. Love that doesn't need to manipulate, strength that doesn't need to shout, peace that doesn't beg for validation. They resented you for it, even as they depended on it. You became their emotional anchor, their secret supply of light, their compass in storms they created. And yet, the more they took from you, the more they realized they could never become you. You weren't playing a role, you were real. And that kind of authenticity is unbearable to someone hiding from themselves. So they punished you for the mirror, not directly, not always with fists or words, but with confusion, with silence, with moments of charm followed by cold detachment, with praise one day and cruelty the next. They were hoping you'd question yourself instead of seeing the truth of them. That's the game they play. Break your reflection so they don't have to face their own, but something in you resisted. Maybe it started as a whisper, a tiny crack in the trance, a voice saying, "This isn't love, this isn't safe, this isn't who I am." You started to pull the mirror back toward yourself, and what you saw wasn't brokenness. It was clarity, strength, purpose. You were never the chaos. You were the clarity that exposed it. You were placed in their life not as a victim, but as a revealer, a disruptor of dysfunction, a force they couldn't silence. And though it cost you sleep, confidence, time, it gave you something far more eternal. The mirror didn't just reflect them, it reflected you, all of you, your scars, your softness, your strength, and you started to see that what they feared wasn't you. It was the parts of you they could never replicate. They didn't love you, they needed you, needed your reflection to feel real, needed your validation to feel powerful. But love doesn't drain, love doesn't control, love doesn't ask you to dim. And once you remembered that, the mirror cracked wide open, and this time, it wasn't your soul that shattered. You don't have to carry their reflection anymore. Let them face their own image. You were never meant to become them. You were sent to reveal them and then rise beyond. They were not your destiny. You were the reminder that something greater lives in truth, even when it hurts. You were the mirror they couldn't avoid, and now you're the light they can no longer reach. They knew exactly where to strike, not by accident, not in ignorance, but with calculated precision. The narcissist doesn't aim randomly. They aim for your softness, for your childhood bruises that never healed, for the fears you thought were buried and forgotten. They listen carefully, not to love you, but to arm themselves with your vulnerabilities. What made you human became what made you hurt. At first, it felt like understanding, like someone finally seeing you. The way they leaned in when you spoke about the pain in your past, the way they nodded with intensity when you described your struggles, those were not signs of empathy. They were the silent gathering of ammunition. They were archiving your wounds for a later time because they know when love fails to control, pain can do the job. They chose the wound for a reason. If you were abandoned once, they knew how to trigger that fear of being left behind. If you were neglected, they mastered the art of going cold. If you doubted your worth, they twisted compliments into criticism so subtly, you began to believe the lies came from inside you. They didn't destroy you with thunder. They eroded you with whispers. Quiet enough to be denied, but sharp enough to draw blood. And still, you stayed. Not because you didn't see the cracks, but because you hoped the love you gave would patch them. Because the apology would come, the cycle would restart, and for a moment, the wound would feel like it was healing. But healing in the hands of someone who created the injury isn't healing at all, it's sedation. And sedation is not peace. The wound was their weapon. They found the old pain inside you and used it like a key to keep the door open. But what they didn't anticipate, what they never anticipate, is that pain, once awakened, doesn't just lie down again. Pain has a voice. Pain remembers. Pain becomes a teacher, a trail guide, a siren that grows louder with every cycle of betrayal. You began to feel it. That ache wasn't just sadness anymore. It became suspicion. It became awareness. The very wound they used to keep you close began to make you watch them more closely. You caught the inconsistencies, the way their apologies never included change, the way their affection came at a cost, the way your spirit started shrinking just to keep the peace. You started asking questions, not out loud yet, but inside, where truth begins its whisper. And eventually, something inside you cracked open, not the way they wanted, not the way they hoped. They wanted you broken enough to comply, but you broke in a different way. You broke open to yourself. You began to question not just them, but the parts of you that allowed the pattern to repeat. You turned inward, not to find blame, but to find origin. You asked, why did I ignore the red flags? Because your wound made red feel like home. You asked, why did I stay after the silence, the disrespect, the games? Because your wound made you believe love meant suffering. You asked, why did I give more, even when I had nothing left? Because your wound told you your value depended on your sacrifice. And this is where the wake-up begins, not outside, not when they discard you, but inside, when you realize you were never truly seeing yourself. You were trying to survive. You were trying to make sense of chaos using the blueprint of your own unhealed story. But now the wound, raw and exposed, is telling you the truth, and the truth hurts, but it also heals. Because the wound doesn't just show you the pain, it shows you what you're capable of. You survived what should have broken you. You kept showing up for others when no one showed up for you. You kept believing in love even when it came wrapped in deception. That is not weakness. That is sacred endurance. That is soul-deep courage. And now the weapon they use becomes the fire that forges something new. You no longer respond the same. You no longer explain your worth. You no longer tolerate almost love or someday love. The things you once accepted with excuses now sound like alarms. The things you once ignored now sting with clarity. You feel more, you see more, you know more. You stop blaming yourself, not because you're in denial, but because you understand. People who prey on wounds are not reflections of your value. They are signs of your need to finally turn inward and protect it. You weren't weak for trusting, you were human. You weren't foolish for staying, you were hopeful. And now you are wiser. You begin the process of closing that wound, not by forgetting, but by learning. You draw boundaries, not to keep people out, but to keep your spirit safe. You listen to your intuition, not as a warning, but as a compass. You speak your truth, not to convince anyone, but because it liberates you. The narcissist thought they'd leave you smaller, but they woke something they could not control. They underestimated the depth of what lives inside someone who has been to the bottom of themselves and did not drown. You became conscious, and consciousness cannot be undone. You see them now for what they are, not a god, not a monster, just a wounded soul who chose destruction over healing. But you chose to rise. The wound was the weapon, but now it's your wisdom, your edge, your reason for growth. They didn't realize that in striking your deepest scar, they'd awaken your deepest power. And that power is yours now, unshakable, unborrowed, undeniable. Some lessons cannot be whispered to you. Some awakenings do not come in the form of comfort or quiet insight. There are purposes inside of people so profound, so deeply embedded in their spirit, that the only thing strong enough to bring them forward is fire. And yours? Yours required it. You didn't end up in the hands of a narcissist by mistake. You weren't chosen because you were naive, foolish, or weak. You were chosen because the fire inside you needed a match. And sometimes that match looks like betrayal. Sometimes it looks like gaslighting, isolation, emotional manipulation. Not because you deserved any of it, but because what was buried inside of you, the clarity, the courage, the calling, could not be reached any other way. There is something about being pushed to your edge that strips away illusion. When the mask of love falls off, when the lies come to the surface, when your heart breaks open wider than you thought possible, that is when your real self begins to rise. Not the version of you that lives to please, not the one that compromises truth to keep the peace, but the one who says, I will not be consumed. Fire does that. It burns away what cannot stay. It exposes what you tried to suppress. It forces you to look at what you've ignored for too long. You didn't ask for the fire, but you needed it. Because before it came, you were surviving, not living. You were accommodating dysfunction, calling it love. You were sacrificing yourself to earn something that should have been freely given. And deep down, a part of you knew, a part of you always knew. But the cost of truth felt too high until the fire made it unavoidable. When you were in it, it felt endless. You questioned yourself more than you questioned them. You doubted your worth, your instincts, your memories. You wondered if you were the problem. That's what the fire does. It brings every shadow forward. But the fire, cruel as it may seem, was not meant to destroy you. It was meant to refine you, to bring you face to face with the parts of you that needed healing, to show you the difference between love and control, between peace and compliance, between being chosen and being used. What they took from you was real time, trust, pieces of your self-esteem, but what they awakened in you is greater. You began to see your patterns, your programming, your people-pleasing, your fear of abandonment. You saw how you gave too much, expected too little, stayed too long. And instead of letting that knowledge shame you, you began to let it shape you. The fire made you honest. It made you fierce. It made you let go of illusions that were never meant to hold you. That relationship, that connection, that situation, it wasn't the destination. It was the flame that lit the path toward your higher self. You had to be shaken loose from your old life so that you could step into your true one. Some people spend a lifetime avoiding the fire. They resist the discomfort, protect their abusers, defend dysfunction, all in the name of not feeling pain. But not you. You walked through it, you felt the sting, you cried the tears, you grieved the version of yourself that thought love had to hurt. And in doing so, you came out the other side not just wiser, but reclaimed. Your purpose requires that level of clarity, that level of power, that level of knowing. You're not here to live halfway. You're not here to shrink so others can feel big. You're not here to repeat generational cycles that keep pain in place. You are here to break the pattern, to stand for something, to heal what was hidden, to speak what was silenced. And that's not something you learn from comfort. That's something the fire teaches. It showed you what you are not, so you could remember who you are. It showed you what it means to rebuild, not from desperation, but from dignity. You now make choices with discernment, not desperation. You now love with boundaries, not blind surrender. You now stand with a strength that can't be shaken by flattery or fear. The fire didn't make you bitter. It made you brilliant. It didn't steal your softness. It gave it shape. It didn't destroy your spirit. It revealed your soul. Everything you're becoming, resilient, whole, rooted in truth, is because you didn't run from the fire. You let it transform you. That is why you had to go through it, because your purpose was never small. It was never quiet. It was never meant to be lived behind the mask of someone else's approval. It was forged in fire. And now it burns bright with a light no narcissist, no manipulator, no shadow can ever dim. They didn't need saving. They needed consequences. And you, unknowingly, walked into their life thinking you could be the difference, that your love would be the one that reached them, that your patience would soften them, that your loyalty would inspire them to change. You gave them the benefit of every doubt, made excuses for every cruelty, and held space they never earned. You thought you were their healer, their helper, their hope. But the truth, the one you likely realized far too late, is this: you were never their lifeline. You were their lesson. From the start, they knew what you were. They recognized your energy before you even spoke. The way you showed up fully, the way you gave freely, the way you carried warmth like a second skin. And to them, that was currency. You were something to consume, not because they didn't know your value, but because they did. It's not that they didn't see your worth. It's that they never planned to honor it. People like them don't seek partners. They seek providers, emotional providers, psychological providers. Someone who will cushion their ego, validate their manipulation, and offer endless second chances. But a lifeline doesn't ask for that kind of sacrifice. A lifeline sustains you without suffocating you. They wanted your energy, your admiration, your devotion, but they never planned to reciprocate. They didn't want mutuality. They wanted maintenance, so they fed you just enough to keep you reaching. A compliment here, an apology there, a hollow promise to do better. And in your heart, the part that loves deeply, you held on to hope. You told yourself they're trying. You told yourself everyone has flaws. You gave them love in advance, credit for growth they hadn't earned. You mistook potential for proof. And that's where they kept you, waiting for the breakthrough that was never coming. But the truth always bubbles up, slowly at first, a quiet discontent, a nagging sense that something isn't right, that you're always giving but rarely receiving, that your joy depends on their mood, that your peace comes second to their power, and as much as you tried to adjust, to shrink, to explain, to compromise, you couldn't shake the feeling that you were more exhausted than empowered. Then comes the shift, the moment when the fog begins to lift, when your intuition gets too loud to ignore, when the lies don't sit as easily in your soul. That's when you begin to wake up, not just to them, but to yourself. You start to see that the love you offered was not lost. It was just mismatched, given to someone who was not meant to keep it, but to teach you what to do with it. They were never going to change because of you. That was never your assignment. They were supposed to confront who they are because of what they lost when you walked away. You were the one who stood with open hands, and they were the ones who tried to take without ever holding. But the lesson wasn't yours to carry. It was theirs to learn. They may never admit it. Narcissists rarely do. But you became the mirror they couldn't look away from. You reflected back everything they refused to see, the pain they caused, the lies they told, the emptiness of their charm. And when you stopped playing the role they assigned to you, when you stood in your truth instead of their fantasy, they didn't just lose you. They lost access to a version of themselves they pretended to be. Some lessons don't come with closure. Some don't end with apologies or acknowledgments. Sometimes your closure is the decision to stop bleeding for someone who wouldn't even offer a bandage. It's the realization that your love was never the problem, that your kindness wasn't a weakness, that your willingness to believe in someone's better nature wasn't naive. It was noble, but it was not your job to pull someone out of their darkness when they're determined to stay there. You were never meant to be their fix. You were meant to be their moment of reckoning. You were the person who came into their life with truth, presence, and genuine love. And when they mishandled it, when they tried to twist it or crush it, you became the evidence of their failure to evolve, not because you failed them, but because they failed themselves. And while they may move on to someone else, remember this: people who don't learn their lesson repeat the cycle. They may find another supply, another source of light to dim, but the lesson will follow them. They will be reminded of you in every honest interaction they sabotage. They will remember your boundaries in every silence that follows their chaos. They will carry the echo of your exit in every empty connection they create. You weren't their lifeline. You weren't their savior. You were the moment they were meant to look at themselves and choose better. Whether they do or not, that's not on you. You didn't lose by leaving. You won by remembering who you are. You won by recognizing that love is not about enduring harm. You won by walking away, not to punish them, but to preserve you. Because your purpose was never to fix the broken. It was to rise above the breaking. You were their lesson, and that is something they'll never outrun. They told you that you were too sensitive, that you overreacted, that you imagined things, that you read too much into words. They made your feelings feel like burdens, like obstacles, like flaws to be corrected. And so you started to shrink, didn't you? You started to doubt your instincts, suppress your truth, swallow your voice. You believed that your sensitivity was the reason for the chaos, the tension, the blame, but that was never the truth. Your sensitivity wasn't the problem, it was the threat. Not to you, but to them, because sensitivity is awareness, it's intuition, it's connection. It's your built-in radar for dishonesty, manipulation, and misalignment. And people who benefit from your confusion will always find a way to pathologize your clarity. If they can convince you that your sensitivity is a weakness, they can continue their control without interruption. But the very thing they tried to shame in you was the key all along. Your sensitivity is your compass. It's the gift that lets you walk into a room and feel what's not being said. It's the part of you that catches the subtle shifts, the silent betrayals, the energetic dissonance between word and action. You were never too much. You were just enough to notice what others missed, and that made you inconvenient to those who wanted to get away with less. You were able to feel when love was faked, when apologies were empty, when praise was manipulative. You knew, long before you had the words for it, that something was wrong. But you silenced that inner knowing because it didn't fit the story they told you. They were charming. They were loving. They said all the right things. So when your feelings told a different story, you assumed you were wrong. That's the power of emotional manipulation. It doesn't just blind you, it teaches you to doubt your own eyes. It makes you question your own heartbeat. You begin to hand over your inner authority, not because you're broken, but because you're trying to preserve the peace. You wanted to believe in the good. You wanted love to be enough. You wanted harmony so deeply that you began to treat your own sensitivity like an enemy. But something sacred happens when a sensitive soul gets pushed too far, when they finally realize that their feelings aren't flaws, they're flags, that their emotions are data, that their tears aren't weakness, but truth rising to the surface. One day, you stopped asking, "What's wrong with me?" and you started asking, "What's really going on here?" That was the shift. That was the awakening. That's when you began to reclaim your sensitivity as a source of strength, because it always was. It's what made you loyal, even when it hurt. It's what made you notice when others were in pain. It's what gave you the ability to sit with someone in silence and still understand them. Your sensitivity was never the curse. They just couldn't handle being seen that deeply. You see, people who live behind masks feel threatened by those who see clearly. Your ability to feel truth meant they couldn't hide. Your emotional honesty made them uncomfortable because it held a mirror to their contradictions. So they had two choices: face themselves or shame you into silence. And most chose the latter, not because you were wrong, but because you were right in ways they didn't want to admit. And still, you rose. You learned how to protect your peace. You stopped explaining your tears. You stopped apologizing for needing depth. You stopped minimizing your reactions just to make others comfortable. You learned that feeling deeply doesn't make you fragile. It makes you real. In a world that rewards performance, authenticity is radical, and you, with your heart wide open and your soul tuned to truth, are a revolution all your own. You began to set boundaries, not out of resentment, but out of reverence for yourself. You started to trust your gut, even when no one else understood it. You began to leave rooms where your sensitivity was dismissed instead of cherished. And with every act of self-respect, you rewrote the narrative they tried to put on you. They called you dramatic when you were discerning. They called you needy when you were simply naming your needs. They said you were overthinking when you were actually observing what they wanted hidden. But now, you know better. Now, you understand that people who don't honor your sensitivity are not qualified to hold your heart. Your softness is not a flaw. It is not a liability. It is not something to outgrow. It is the very fabric of who you are. It is your connection to your purpose. It is the doorway to your gifts. It's what makes you an artist, a healer, a truth teller, a protector. The world needs more of that, not less, and certainly not less of you. What once made you the target of manipulation now makes you the keeper of wisdom. You see through the illusions, you feel the lies, you know when energy shifts, when words don't match action, when love isn't clean. And now, instead of internalizing that as failure, you understand it as insight. You are not broken. You were never broken. You are attuned. And that attunement, the very sensitivity they mocked, is the key to your freedom. It's what led you away from people who fed off your confusion. It's what pointed you back to your truth when you got lost in their stories. It's what keeps you awake, aware, and anchored in your worth. You don't need to harden to be safe. You don't need to numb to be strong. You just need to honor the emotional intelligence that has always lived within you. You were born with the gift of depth. You were born with the gift of feeling, and no matter what they said, no matter how they tried to make you hide it, your sensitivity is not the storm. It is your shelter. So feel fully, love boldly, listen deeply, speak honestly. Your sensitivity is not a curse. It is the compass that keeps you whole. It is the key. The whole time, it always was. There's always someone who enters your life and turns it upside down, not with love, not with care, but with chaos dressed as passion, control disguised as affection, and manipulation masked as attention. They didn't come to build with you. They came to consume. And you, full of heart and hope, believed they were part of your story's design. But the truth is, they were never your destination. They were the spark that set your transformation in motion. They were the catalyst, but you are the creator. At first, you didn't see it that way. How could you? You were drowning in confusion, lost in a maze of mixed signals, gaslit apologies, and emotional withdrawal. They knew how to pull you close, only to push you away. They studied you, mimicked your values, echoed your dreams, until you no longer knew where you ended and they began. You tried to hold it all together, convinced that if you could love them harder, show more patience, stay a little longer, it would all settle. But it never did. And that's the point. It was never supposed to. Their role wasn't to stay and love you right. Their role was to wake you up, because somewhere along the way you stopped listening to yourself. You silenced your voice, ignored your gut, and betrayed your own needs for the sake of connection. You forgot that you were not made to shrink for someone else's comfort. So the universe sent you someone who would press every button, scratch every wound, and push you so far that you'd have no choice but to remember who you are. They didn't destroy you, they revealed you. And while that revelation came with grief, with loss, with heartbreak, it also came with clarity. You saw what love is not. You learned the difference between attention and intention, between possession and presence. You discovered the cost of abandoning yourself and the sacred value of returning. In the beginning, it felt like you had nothing left, like the version of you that existed before them had vanished. And maybe she did, but that was never the version of you that was meant to last. You're not here to go back. You're here to become. Because after the silence, after the nights, you cried for someone who never truly saw you. After the apologies you never got and the closure that never came, something shifted. You stopped asking why they hurt you and started asking why you stayed. You stopped begging for answers and started giving yourself the truth. That's when you took your power back. Quietly, slowly, but fully. And in that stillness, you began to rebuild, not in reaction to them, but in service of you. You began to create boundaries that protected your peace. You started listening to the voice you once ignored. You made space for healing, for solitude, for growth. You learned to trust yourself again, and in doing so, you became the very thing they tried to convince you you'd never be, whole without them. They may have lit the match, but you built the fire. They cracked the shell, but you did the rising. They forced the ending, but you wrote the next chapter. That's the power you've always had. The power to create something beautiful from the ashes they left behind. The power to choose yourself, not as a reaction to pain, but as a declaration of worth. You are not a victim of their story. You are the author of your own. You decide where this goes next. You decide what love looks like from here on out. You decide the standards, the pace, the path. They were just the storm that cleared the ground. You are the builder, the creator, the one who rises. And the beauty is this: you no longer need them to be sorry. You no longer need them to see your value, because you see it now. Every tear taught you something. Every silence gave you space. Every ending opened the door to a beginning you wouldn't have reached without the pain. So let them be the lesson. Let them be the catalyst. That's all they were ever meant to be. But you are the creator, the sculptor of your future, the guardian of your soul. And the woman who walks away from what tried to break her is never the same as the one who once stayed. She's wiser, stronger, and finally, free. You were never placed in a narcissist's life to suffer. You were sent to witness, to learn, to rise. The truth is shocking, not because it's cruel, but because it's freeing. You were not just a chapter in their book. You were the plot twist they didn't expect. And now, you are the story worth reading.